You may have wondered and often asked yourself, who really decides what we learn and what we are taught to ignore? As you know, every culture has its own norms, values and beliefs, and we have cultures within cultures. Cultural hegemony refers to the power of the dominant culture, which ultimately decides what's important, essential and valuable, and what is marginal, incidental and optional in education. Numerous philosophers and famous educators such as Noam Chomsky, Paulo Freire and Fairclough have explained the way cultural hegemony manufactures consent through general consensus, which determines what is considered to be important knowledge and skills. My PhD thesis explores this relationship between culture and creativity in development of creativity skills in the vocational business curriculum in further education colleges, and I reflect on my own role as an ex-Ofsted inspector. I used a wide range of data sources, including 22 interviews with business owners, business teachers and business students, 89 Ofsted inspection reports for the business curriculum, 329 Times Educational Supplement articles and 235 further education college websites. I also used data from my public engagement activities, which involved over 1,000 contacts on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube in two-way interactions where I asked my contacts to respond to my questions and give me feedback on the assumptions I was making as I progressed through my research. After gathering data from external sources, I reflected on my own internal experience and my ideological preferences as an Ofsted inspector from 2012 to 2015, as a business teacher for many years, and also as a business student on my MBA course. I was surprised to find that my values were very different in each of these roles. For example, as a business teacher, I favoured a humanist pedagogy focusing on creating a classroom environment conducive to learning, whereas in the role of a business student, I preferred a behaviourist methodology with tangible outcomes and very efficient use of time. Our ideologies determine what we believe to be the purpose of education. The general consensus, which Gramsci refers to as the common sense in further education, is that we are preparing individuals to take their place in society and the workplace. However, the past few decades have shown just how unpredictable societies and the work environment can be, so we need to reconsider and reflect on the common assumptions underlying the education we're providing. Many educators, for example John Holt, have been advising for decades that the best we can do is to prepare students for an uncertain future and teach them how to learn instead of filling them with information they may never use. However, we have to acknowledge that traditionally, certain skills, for example conformity, which can be called flexibility, are linked with success in the workplace, whereas skills such as creativity are recognised inconsistently. There is research indicating that teachers tend to prefer students who score highly on intelligence tests because they tend to conform to the teacher's own expectations, whereas students who score highly on creativity tests tend to do their own thing and they don't conform to the values of their teachers, and as a consequence, they're not as popular. My own research findings highlighted distinct characteristics of students associated with creativity. Positive traits included confidence, working hard, being popular and influential. Negative traits included being withdrawn, lazy, unpopular and disruptive. At first glance, it seemed as though my data illustrated two types of creative people. However, using a systems thinking perspective and the Chinese yin-yang concept where masculine energy merges into feminine energy, I realized that creative people can express each of these contrasting traits depending on their response to their cultural context. In other words, the traits are not fixed, but fluid. So a person who seems to be disruptive in one context may be seen to be influential in another. This raises ethical questions about student profiling and labelling students with attributes as though they are fixed aspects of their character instead of adaptive, contextualised behaviour. The education culture, which may encourage students to behave one way or the other, is apparent in the organisation's vision, mission and value statements. The vision statement usually expresses how the organisation intends to add value to the community. The mission statement expresses its reason for existing, and the values indicate its top priorities and strategies. Based on my analysis of 235 college websites, I found that 33% of them recognise the value of respect in their cultural statements. In contrast, only 7% specifically prioritise the value of creativity. In other words, out of 235 colleges, only 16 recognised creativity as part of the college culture in its vision, mission and value statements. Cultural hegemony exerts its power and influence to maintain the status quo through surveillance. The French philosopher Foucault used the metaphor of the panopticon to explain how surveillance disciplines and punishes. The panopticon is an architectural design used in prisons where there's a glass tower in the centre surrounded by prison cells with glass walls around the perimeter. Foucault calls this central glass tower the eye of power. In this architectural design, people feel that they are being watched even when the central glass tower is in fact empty. Similarly, the metaphoric glass tower of Ofsted exerts a controlling gaze which is pervasive in its influence throughout the world of further education in England. As in the panopticon, everyone is watching everyone else and at the same time being watched through statistics, reports and focus groups. So even when Ofsted inspectors are not physically present, the inspection system manages to exert its power through what Foucault calls its regimes of truth. One of these regimes of truth are the national average statistics for success rates in further education colleges. These are used to normalise education through benchmarks, comparing the performance of each college with the norm, which is the national average. Colleges are expected to remain significantly above the national average, aiming for 100% success rate. Falling significantly below national averages triggers a response from what Foucault calls the eye of power, and it can result in Ofsted inspectors being sent in to exert their discipline accordingly. This normalisation doesn't take into account the personal needs of the students, and it doesn't account for the cultural context in which they are performing. In addition to normalisation, cultural hegemony exerts itself in the drive towards standardisation. So-called best practice teaching strategies have become ritualised in lesson planning and lesson delivery. For example, teachers are expected to set SMART goals, which are often limited to tangible, evidence-based outcomes related to successful completion of the course. Through SMART goals, it can be very difficult to evaluate learning which is invisible, creative, and likely to express itself in the long term rather than the short term. As a result, that kind of learning becomes incidental and marginalised rather than a priority. The teaching profession is increasingly reliant on performativity, which includes measuring the performance of teachers through graded lesson observations and linking their performance, albeit implicitly, to the outcomes achieved by their students in terms of qualifications and grades. When we are led to believe that performativity is common sense through cultural hegemony and general consensus, it pressurizes teachers to focus narrowly on exam preparation and completion of course assignments. One of the themes I identified in my own data is that the constant surveillance and performativity creates fear, stress, and anxiety, which is not conducive to creativity. Existing research shows that pressure to perform blocks creativity. State-funded education is usually under pressure to prioritize efficiency and to demonstrate good value for money. This leads many teachers to resort to overusing textbooks and pre-planned materials when they feel overworked or they don't have enough time to be creative. It's often much more efficient to tell students what they need to know instead of guiding them to find out for themselves. Learning creatively just takes too long. Business in a capitalist society thrives on competition, so we could say it's common sense that we teach our business students to be competitive. However, some researchers have warned that competition may inhibit learning if it stimulates too much fear, anxiety, and stress. Although the relatively small number of students who usually win competitions gain in confidence, we need to weigh this against the relatively large number of students who don't often win and therefore lose confidence in their skills. The constant losers may learn to continuously compare themselves unfavorably with their peers. By training them to become accustomed to not winning, we may be setting them up for failure in a competitive business environment where they expect to lose and they leave school having an image of themselves as not being very good at winning in competitions, similar to people who define themselves after they've left school as not being very creative. But what does a creative person look like? Well, what kind of image do you have when you think of a creative person? In a diverse society, our image of the kind of people we expect to be creative will be very different, and certain roles seem to be reserved for those who fit our image for the type of person we expect to occupy that space. Someone who doesn't fit our image of being creative may be accused of not fitting in or rocking the boat, whereas someone who does fit the image with the same behaviour may be praised for having good ideas and bringing a fresh perspective to the organisation. In further education colleges, I expected to find a high level of sensitivity and awareness of equality and diversity to avoid such unfair biases. However, I was disappointed to find that only around half of the 89 Ofsted reports that I analysed suggested that equality and diversity is being promoted well in further education colleges. I was also disappointed to find that 40% of these reports suggested that equality and diversity are not being promoted well. This may be a weakness in the way Ofsted reports are written and interpreted. Alternatively, the findings may indicate that, despite the existence of an equality and diversity agenda, evidence that it's actually being implemented remain low, which undermines trust and therefore creativity. In addition to lack of trust, the lack of a shared language around creativity in the business context causes challenges that undermine development of creativity skills. For many of my students, adding pictures and colourful titles using word art to their work was an expression of creativity. On the other hand, as a business studies teacher, I was expecting an element of surprise, originality, and what they call a unique selling point in business jargon. In order to bridge this gap in communication, I synthesized some of the existing research on the subject and highlighted various attributes to describe a comprehensive concept of creativity. I used a systems thinking approach to synthesize my research findings, looking for patterns and relationships to connect the dots. One of the criticisms of this approach is that it doesn't clearly consider relationships of power. In fact, the systems thinking perspective is that if we position different people at a particular location in the system, they will invariably behave in the same way. In other words, in order to change behaviour, we need to change the system. However, the power exerted through cultural hegemony is not centralised, it's dispersed. So, to an extent, we can overcome the issue of unequal power dynamics through critical reflection, questioning and challenging what is considered to be common sense. The second criticism of systems thinking is that it looks at the exterior facade of the system rather than the interior dynamics. In order to address this criticism, I used my own inner reflections from my previous role as an Ofsted inspector, in addition to looking at the system from an external point of view. Based on a synthesis of both internal and external data, I believe that creativity thrives under conditions of trust, collaboration, and shared language, rather than surveillance and competitive performativity. In my view, to promote development of creativity skills in education, we need to transform the cultural discourse, which is leading gatekeepers such as Ofsted inspectors to take their position in the metaphoric panopticon, implementing policies and procedures constructed in compliance with the dominant cultural discourse. If the role of Ofsted is limited to surveillance, then CCTV cameras would be a much more cost-effective way to normalise, standardise and measure performativity.
The one question was, you said that as a business student you had a different pedagogical view, and as a business teacher you had a different pedagogical view. And I wanted to ask, because being a teacher is different to being a student, very different.
Yeah.
Were these two differences for you as a person incompatible, or, you know?
I was surprised because I always, I've been teaching for 30 years, and so for 30 years I've always idealised humanism. I always thought I'm a humanist teacher, and I thought I was a humanist student as well. But when I reflected, I realised that all my negative experiences of education is when I felt, well, what did I learn? I don't know what I learned. So I realised that what I wanted was tangible outcomes, and I wanted value for money. I wanted to, I've made all this investment in coming to class, I've spent all this money and my time, what have I got for it? That was very much of a behaviourist.
I understand that, but I don't understand why the humanistic point of view may not be bringing results, tangible results.
Yeah, because even at this university, there are teachers who use a humanist approach, and I go away thinking, why did I bother coming here? I feel that I haven't learnt anything.
I see. And the second question was, you were looking at creativity skills and how they can be encouraged. And I wanted to ask, were you looking at specific skills, and if so, what were they?
Well, when I started, it was about, what exactly do we mean by creativity in the business context, you see? And so then that's when I realised, well, we don't really have a shared understanding of what it means in business. People have ideas about, they think that creativity is the same as being artistic, or it's the same as like having a talent, being a musician, but no, we're talking about creativity in business, and I realise that it's a very broad area, that it's to do with not just the person, it's to do with persuading society, and that's where culture comes in, because unless the culture recognises the creativity, well, does it really exist?
Okay.
Okay, we'll take one more. We're a little bit.
Just a quick comment on and a question. My name is Abdullah, and what you said about Ofsted type observations, I'm kind of thinking, will it ever capture creativity because of resources and time? Because the observations seem to be very short.
I don't think Ofsted will, because what I've realised that because surveillance is inimical to creativity, creativity doesn't respond well to being observed.
That's right, yeah.
It doesn't.
I agree.
Yeah.
So that's my comment. And then the second thing about ideologies, really similar to your question, talked about student perspectives and teacher perspectives. So what's the ideology you being an Ofsted inspector when you do conduct your observations? Behaviorist observer.
Very, yeah, because when we are writing our reports, well, it's much easier to write about the evidence that we have observed, and that's the criticism. It's like, well, what about all the things that are invisible to us. There's no way to record what is invisible, and therefore Ofsted does favour a behaviourist pedagogy, even though it says it doesn't.
So in an ideal situation, you would want all these three perspectives to come together: the student view, the teachers, and the behaviourist views, to come together for an ideal.
That's right, but my argument is that the leaning is very much towards behaviourism compared with humanism.
Okay. Thank you very much.